Next, we're going to now hear from Miss Chloe Cole, who's here to tell us about her personal experience with this type of supposed medical care. Miss Cole, you are recognized.
I'm an 18-year-old detransition woman from the Central Valley of California. I commend Florida for stepping up to the rights and safety of our children and preventing what happened to me as a child from happening to other children. I transitioned and detransitioned all while I was a minor. When I was in middle and high school, at roughly the age of 12, I started feeling that after years of being a tomboy, being a more masculine girl, and a misfit amongst all the other girls, I was, in fact, a boy this whole time. I began cutting my hair and wearing boys' clothing to reflect this belief. I experimented with new names, and eventually I wrote a letter to my mom and dad telling them that I wanted to be their son. They were concerned because they knew very little about the subject, and they certainly didn't expect to hear such a thing from their own daughter. I don't think any parent really does. So they decided to send me to a therapist, and their expectation was that they would get to the bottom of my distress and where it was stemming from, that in therapy, my feelings would be resolved. But this did not happen. This is far from what happened. When they voiced their concerns to my doctors, they were immediately shot down. Immediately, the therapists and eventually the gender specialists. Their approach was only to affirm my identity. There was no questioning. There was not a proper psychological evaluation done. My mom and dad were told that children are already confident in their gender identities from early childhood, that I knew exactly what I wanted, and if I were not affirmed, it was very likely that I would kill myself. It was life or death, and mom and dad were not given any other option but to allow me to transition. And so I was put onto the path of medical transition, starting with puberty blockers and testosterone at 13. A few months after starting testosterone, I was sexually assaulted by a classmate of mine out of fear of the assault happening a second time and of being recognized as my biological sex ever again. I started to use a compression device called a chest binder. By the time that I entered my freshman year, my voice was already considerably deeper, and I looked just like pretty much any other boy my age. I passed considerably well as the opposite sex throughout high school, but I still lived with great anxiety of being discovered as a biological female, especially because I was still using male restrooms and locker facilities. One day after coming home from school, I started feeling a dull sensation that started turning into stabbing pains in my lower abdomen. I realized that these were uterine cramps, and they were worse than any period cramps I had ever had in my life. I figured that it was because I was experiencing atrophy of my reproductive organs. This atrophy was treated with topical estrogen, and for the most part, these cramps disappeared. They lessened. In the middle of my sophomore year, after years of using a binder and wearing this thing for anywhere from around 8 to 12 hours on weekdays, and whenever I went out to work out or swim, or whenever I had guests over at home, I was sick of it. I thought of myself to be like any other boy my age, and I wanted my body to reflect that. So I spoke to my therapist about my desire to get my breasts removed. Then I was referred to a gender specialist who then gave me a letter of recommendation to a surgeon. Several appointments with the surgeon later, about a month before my 16th birthday, I went under the knife. Initially, when I woke up from the surgery, I was happy. I was very happy. To me, it was a major milestone in my transition and a big step in the right direction. It was an outpatient surgery, so I was immediately sent home pretty much as soon as the medication wore off and I was conscious. My mom had to take a few weeks off from work to take care of me while I was recovering because it was a major surgery in the upper area of my body and I had very little range of motion. I couldn't even lift my arms up until about 2 or 3 months afterward. But after about a week or so, I had to get my stitches taken out, and it was the most disgusting feeling I had ever had in my life. The sensation was there, but it was very numb and very dull. and it made me nauseous, and I nearly threw up a few times. Once I was sent home, I started having to regularly change my dressings after every shower, and during every shower, I had to look down at this wounded area of my body. It wasn't really the scars that bothered me so much, but the type of incision that I was given was called a double mastectomy with nipple grafts, meaning that they excised into the breast and took out the tissue. They also cut around my areolas and they did a deep scrape on an area of my chest and then put the areolas onto that area of scraped skin to simulate a more masculine positioning of the nipples. Because during this process, the blood supply was cut off, the top layer of skin was now completely dead and it was black. I was told that this would be part of the process, but nothing really would have prepared me for it until I actually went through it. And with every shower, I watched this dead skin slowly fall off. It was hard to watch that happening to my own body. After a while, I started to actually realize that I missed being feminine. I missed things like wearing makeup and having my hair long and wearing skirts and dresses. And there were other things that I missed about being a woman as well. Socially, as a male, it's not easy. There's a lot less room for expressing yourself, either in the way you present yourself or even just talking about your feelings and emotions. I found that a lot of my relationships with my peers, with my friends, with both boys and girls, and even within my family were a lot less emotionally fulfilling, and I felt very alone. I started to go down an emotional downward spiral into my junior and senior years, and my grades dropped. I had a very low GPA. By this point in time, I was hardly even attending my classes sometimes. In my junior year, in an online class, I was taking a psychology class. Towards the end of the class, there were lessons on things like parenting and childhood development. During my consultations with the endocrinologist and their surgeon, I was told things like I may not be able to have children as an adult if I were to go on blockers or hormones, and that if I were to get my breasts removed, I would never be able to breastfeed. And at the time, none of this really meant anything to me because I was still a kid. I was still being taken care of by my parents, and I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know the importance of eventually deciding to have a family of my own. And it was only when I was in that class, when I was learning about this, that I realized that I had a maternal instinct and I wanted to have children down the line. And I knew that because of the decision I made to medically transition as a kid, that may never be possible. And I really couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't keep lying to myself that I was something that I wasn't. And I stopped transitioning cold turkey. I'm only 18. My life is just beginning. I'm far too young to feel like I am a broken woman, but it's hard to look in the mirror. It's hard to look at what has become of my body. And I have to live my entire adulthood knowing I'll never have breasts. I'll never be able to breastfeed my children. And it's possible I might not never be able to carry a child. And sometimes I have episodes where I still see a boy in the mirror and it makes me panic. But the emotional turmoil and regret are far from the worst parts about my story. All of this was a huge failure on the part of my medical practitioners. My mom and dad and I were lied to. We weren't given any other option or informed fully of the potential consequences of medical transition. My parents did sign off, but it was under the false pretense that my life depended on it. I, the 13-year-old, was expected to know exactly what I needed and to know the consequences. I had several comorbidities that the doctors failed to rule out or address. I was previously diagnosed with ADHD, but it actually turned out later that I'm actually on the spectrum. It was actually the gender specialist, the same one who referred me to surgery, who, about a year afterward, told me that I had some pretty key symptoms of autism that I should be screened for it. Even if I was diagnosed with autism, my doctors still would have transitioned me. To this day, and throughout the process of medically transitioning, I've faced several complications from the blockers. While I was on them, because I was already about 3 to 4 years into puberty, it essentially put me into a state of artificial menopause. While I was on them, I started experiencing some hot flashes and itching all over my body, not too unlike what women in their 40s to 50s to 60s tend to experience. After going off of them, years later, I've started getting some joint pains, namely in my limbs and my hands and my fingers. I also get shooting pains up my back. These are pretty sporadic. They don't happen very often, but they've been starting to become more frequent and more painful and more disruptive. From the testosterone, some of the most visible changes would be to my bone structure. I have larger shoulders and smaller hips than most women, and I have more defined features in my face. I also have some issues with my urinary tract. I have to use the restroom rather frequently. I'm often dehydrated because of that, and I'm prone to infections. For a while, it actually got to the point that I would get blood clots in my urine and sometimes little bits of tissue. I'm also experiencing sexual dysfunction, and my fertility is questionable. I am getting periods, and I do have a fairly regular cycle, but I don't know if I'm ovulating or even if I am able to conceive, if I'll be able to safely carry. The worst complications might be from the surgery. I'll never be able to breastfeed my kids, as I said. I have some issues with the sensation. I have very little erogenous sensation, and sometimes I get the feeling of phantom breaths. Sometimes when I'm walking, like going up a flight of stairs, I'll feel them move even though they're not there. The grafts. At first, they seem to be healing fairly well, other than the fact that on top, the area of skin was very dehydrated. But about 2 years post op, they've started to fail. The top area of skin is almost not there, but it's leaking fluid. I have no idea why. I don't know what the fluid is, but I have to bandage my chest daily. I've tried to reach out to my surgeon for help with this, and all I got was just put some Vaseline on it. That was his response, which actually gave me a temporary skin infection. So I can't trust my doctors who helped me get into the situation in the first place to help me now. It's worth noting that most of the serious complications that I'm facing now, I was not informed of. It's very likely that my young age played a part in the onset of many of them. With all that being said, what is it that we can do to help gender dysphoric children? The best and the most obvious solution is to prevent minors from going on these treatments, from taking hormones and blockers and going under the knife in the first place. Conservatives are constantly reacting to the most obvious and immediate dangers, but we fall short when establishing a vision. Right now, the conservative movement is largely just about combating the vision of the left. My question for the DeSantis administration and more broadly, the conservative movement is, what is your vision for the future? What is your vision for helping people suffering with gender dysphoria, for helping the children, parents, and families in need? I've traveled to many states to testify on these bills, and I've noticed a glaring problem. These bills are trying to take away something without replacing it with anything else. We have thousands of individuals who regret their transitions, who want to go off these treatments and detransition, but they have no idea how. There's an epidemic approaching of children and young adults who regret or have been harmed by transition, and we are at the very beginning of the exponential curve. The Florida government is uniquely positioned to not only end the affirmative care model in children, but also to provide a model of care that actually helps gender dysphoric patients of all ages. Right now, detransitioners are their own doctors. We have not a clue about how the endocrine system works, but somehow we have to navigate it without proper blood tests or treatment. The first month after I stopped transitioning, I was tested for my hormone levels, but my endocrinologist gave me the guidelines for the average hormone levels of teenage males. Questions that I've asked my doctors, but never have gotten a proper answer for. How do you taper off of testosterone? Are my hormones stable? Am I fertile? Why are my skin grafts failing and leaking fluid 2 years after surgery? I'm still trying to figure all this out on my own. I can't trust my doctors to help me. I've reached out and have gotten absolutely nothing. I almost committed suicide several times while trying to detransition. So, how do you provide mental health services for a child who's lost her breasts to a political ideology? We need answers now. No doctor knows how to provide care for detransitioners, but the W path has standards of care for dysphoric patients that every major medical institution in North America follows like it's the Bible. We need standards of care for detransitioners now. There is no science supporting gender affirming care for minors, and we need to replace it with something else. Florida needs to step up and do the right thing. Thank you.